when somebody's already had treatment for CLL like Danise is currently on monitoring because she's in a complete remission. But let's say down the road, her disease acts up again. We hope that some of these newer medicines might potentially be curative. As I said, I'd like to think of this as a chronic disease, but obviously the goal of all of us is to make this a curative disease. And there are no doubt there are patients in long-term remission, in other words, who have no recurrence of their disease. And we're hoping those individuals are truly cured, but we'll need many years of follow-up. But for folks who might have had treatment, what other options are there for the future? And clearly, part of that is dependent. I think that many of us, as a CLL physician, I am often thinking ahead. So I need to think not only is what somebody is getting currently, but what potential options are down the road. So even though the patient might be focused on the treatment they're actively getting and preventing any side effects and issues, but I'm also thinking about the future treatments down the line. And so I think that's a strategy that many of us will think about with our folks way in advance, because partly what they might get later might be dependent upon what they've already gotten. So this becomes a more difficult question. So the history of what patients' treatments have been are important. Side effects that they might have had to some of their former therapies is important. So in whether or not as we all get older, we acquire more medical problems, there might be other issues, more organ issues and things that we have to take into account. And then there's the disease itself. So are there changes in the CLL cells that may decide that one therapy might be better for another? So the question about subsequent lines of therapy is a little bit more complicated because it really is dependent upon the patient, their disease characteristics, and their medical issues. And we have to take all of that into account when we consider future options. Obviously, the longer somebody goes between therapies, let's say you're not on a chronic oral therapy, but let's say you're now being on monitoring again, depending upon, Danise will have the option, if she should need treatment again in the future, she can absolutely actually be retreated with venetoclax again. Mm-hmm. But there are other options for therapy too. So another take home I think I want to advocate is that there are lots of treatment options that are available to patients if they relapse and need treatment again, whether that be on a clinical trial or not a clinical trial. And again, part of that discussion really is dependent upon those factors I just discussed, and that your physician will help guide you with your future treatment, depending upon, again, what your organ function is, where your disease is at this current time. Has it changed? Is it more resistant? And what treatments you've had and what types of side effects you might have had to those therapies before. Because the likelihood is if you had a terrible side effect to a drug, we're not going to be using that drug again. So there are lots of options for patients, but it is a little bit more of a complicated discussion because there isn't a roadmap. It isn't you do this, then you do this, then you do this. It's the doctor needs to consider all these factors because you're really an individual. And until there's a one size fits all, which there currently is not, there are many options for patients with CLL. And so that's the good news, but it is a little bit more complicated. I'm not going to lie. There are a lot of factors that have to go into that consideration. And there's lots of new drugs that we're evaluating all the time. So we're looking for new therapies to get us to the next level. The goal is, to have, if you do need treatment, to hopefully make it as seamless as possible with as little side effects as possible, get a good response. But then also we're thinking longevity. How do we go from one to another, to another, to another, to another, so that you can go on living your life? Danise, how has it been for you? I mean, I know we're monitoring you now, yes. But living, with the CLL, the history that you've lived in all these years with CLL, what do you think?
Well, I feel fine. That's the biggest takeaway is I feel fine. And of course, the best outcome would be that I would be monitored forever and never need anything again. But I have faith in medical science. I have faith in the doctors, and there'll be something at the other end if I need it. I just really am convinced of that.
And your lifestyle now and what you've been doing the past couple of years?
Well, my job was flexible, so the treatment didn't cause me a lot of difficulty with my work. But But I retired in September, so now it's all good. I can do whatever I want.
So you did treatment while you were working, though.
Yes.
I think that's a good important point
Yes,
for patients.
no,
She
I
retired after.
Yeah, I retired after. I did the treatment while I was still working. I had a generous sick leave package and flexible colleagues and a flexible work schedule so that it all was manageable. I had reasonably good health insurance, and I think that, I mean, not having good health insurance can be an issue for people with chronic diseases like this.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's something that needs to be considered. It was never a problem for me.
That's an absolute discussion that comes up a lot with patients with CLL, particularly on some of these new chronic oral therapies. Cost is an issue because if you're going to take a drug for the rest of your life, some of these new, remember, these are oral specialty drugs. So if you're on medicine for high blood pressure or diabetes, you're taking medicines every day. Hopefully they're not very expensive, but remember, these are oncology specialty drugs. And so they're dispensed from fancy specialty pharmacies. You don't usually get these in your local pharmacy. And these drugs are very expensive. And so normally, we usually try to make sure that the patient is covered for these drugs or that their copay for the drug is very low. And again, there's lots of assistance, thankfully, through Leukemia and Lymphoma Society and other, and believe it or not, from industry and things to try to get grants and whatnot for patients where cost can be certainly an issue for some of these, these chronic therapies. But we recognize that potentially can be a problem for patients. And again, you got to work with your provider team to help you get through that, because if something that is not, is obviously cost prohibitive, then we have to think of an alternative for our patients. So we recognize that definitely is an issue and comes up a lot on forums and concerns for patients for all chronic diseases, whether they have CLL or another chronic medical problem. So that's very, very important. Mm-hmm. But the work can be an issue. Danise was working. And so she had a flexible job. Mm-hmm. So she was able to manage all this. But we recognize that certainly can be a consideration. Yes. Of what type of treatment somebody may get if they, depending upon what their responsibilities are for work or family or other. So those need to be brought up whether you're on a clinical trial or not a clinical trial. So I want to thank everybody, one, for listening, but two, I want to thank Danise for doing this for patients and being here, and also participating in a clinical trial, which I think is amazing. We understand the work that she put into participating, but again, a drug that is now FDA approved, and she has had a phenomenal response. But again, pushing the field forward and trying to find a cure for patients with CLL is what we're trying to do. So anybody who participates in any of the clinical trials, from a researcher standpoint, from the physicians and staff and nurses, we can't thank you enough for doing that, as we try to obviously do better for you. Danise, do you have any take-home points or advice or things you want to share with everybody?
I think it's really important that people maintain a positive attitude. There is so much coming up through the pipeline. There are so many skilled researchers and physicians working towards an end of this disease. And I think you just have to be positive about it. You just have to, not let it take over your whole life.
I don't think I can say anything better than what she just said. Kudos. Honestly, it's the best I can hope for. But thank you all. We're hoping to do better for you all, to make side effects less complicated and difficult, and obviously to find a cure for patients with CLL. Again, there's a lot of support, lots of new therapies, lots of clinical trials to look for new drugs all the time. So you should stay hopeful, and I think she said it the best. Thank you.